about those ancient artifacts.
Oh, yes. Most of it is useless crap. Recipes and love letters, that sort of thing. Here. Oh, thighs. Oh, juicy thighs.
A love letter?
A recipe.
Hello and welcome back to this parody of multiple things. Today we are looking at MYXIR'S Juicy Thighs from Gothic 3. Alas, while his recipe sounds sumptuous indeed, it provides tragically little detail on how to actually prepare the dish. To wit, I will provide 4 different ways the chefs of Al Shadim might whip up some thighs that will make you realize. For simplicity's sake, I will use chicken thighs in all of these preparations. Utilizing thighs of a different species may yield confusing and tragic results. Method 1 for achieving the juicy thighs of your dreams involves a yogurt-based marinade. For 4 thighs, our marinade will involve half a cup of plain yogurt, 1 tablespoon of harissa paste. I accidentally bought a mild harissa, so I had to supplement with a bit of cayenne pepper, 1 teaspoon of cumin powder, 3 to 4 tablespoons of minced cilantro or your herb of choice. Yes, even that one, I suppose. 1/2 of a lemon juiced, 1 tablespoon of kosher salt, black pepper and or other spices to your preference. Prepare to whisk the ingredients, then remember the 1 teaspoon of olive oil, as well as a clove of garlic you intended to grate into the marinade. Ensure that it flies from your grasp and onto the floor, and briefly consider giving up on cooking forever. These steps are crucial. Whisk into a thoroughly mixed mixture. Looks delicious now, but it shall only get more delicious once we throw raw bird meat into it. To prepare the bird for its bath, we give it a couple slices through the skin side. Theoretically, this allows the marinade to work throughout the whole thing, for you see, flavor is more than skin deep. Toss the thighs throughout the marinade until thoroughly coated. Cover, refrigerate, and let marinate for 2 to 6 hours. As a side to our thighs, let us prepare a Greek-ish couscous salad. Al Shadim is somewhat close to the coast, so in this assumption we will pretend it has a Mediterranean sort of cuisine. Begin by preparing 1 cup of dry couscous to package directions, a step I apparently did not care to demonstrate. Prep some tiny tomatoes by dicing them until you get sick of doing it, about 3/4 of a cup. Deseed and dice an equivalent volume of cucumber. Dice 1/4 of a red onion. When the couscous is cooked and somewhat cooled, add all the vegetable substance to it. Grate in the zest of 1 lemon, then juice it. It is very frustrating to do it the other way around. Seeds are optional and not recommended. To that, we will add 1 tablespoon of red wine vinegar and 2 to 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, the kind you should not cook with. Augment with herb if you desire. Mix to combine thoroughly. Cover and refrigerate to allow flavors to meld before tasting and adding any more salt, vinegar, or oil you find necessary. Having waited 2 to 6 hours, we shall remove our thighs from the marinade and place them on a wire rack over a baking tray lined with parchment. Wipe off excess liquid that will inhibit tasty browning in the oven. Perform final seasoning with a pinch of salt and pepper. Do not be excessive, remember there was salt in the marinade. You may also wish to hedge your browning bets by brushing over a little bit of olive or vegetable oil. These are destined to roast at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for approximately 30 minutes, or until cooked to the recommended not dying of foodborne illness temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit as tested with a quick read thermometer. If you do not have one, then may the odds be in your favor. Additional tip, use a brush or spoon to occasionally baste your thighs with the delicious fatty drippings, as this will help them brown. Once they are finished cooking, allow them to rest briefly to ensure they remain juicy when cutting in. Serve next to our couscous salad, which you do not have to plate as stupidly as I did. Take a juicy bite. If you prefer your thighs a bit more soggy, then braising may be the technique for you. Once again, we shall utilize 4 thighs. I will call this dish inspired by chicken cacciatore, because now nobody Italian is allowed to be angry about it not being authentic. This will utilize the ingredients that I decided to show all at once, despite the fact that I'm about to list them in order in preparation anyway, with one exception. A green bell pepper and a red bell pepper shall be roughly diced, along with 1 yellow onion. Then 2 to 3 cloves of garlic shall be peeled and roughly minced. This is as much knife-based preparation as this dish requires. Upon the stove, heat a steel pan over quite high heat with about 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. Season the thighs with salt and pepper. There's no brine or marinade with this one, so be generous. Place the thighs into the pan skin side down and sear for a few minutes. Once again, we give our thighs a nice tan, but our spa day is far from over. Remove from the pan to a plate and set aside. To the pan with all the lovely fat and drippings, add the onion with a pinch of salt. Stir and saute the onion until they also become kissed with brown. Add the garlic and stir through for a brief saute, about 30 seconds, and then it's wine o'clock. Add about 3/4 of a cup of nice dry white wine, or because I have it around just for cooking, some sherry. Note, this is a bad justification because I could have used a white wine as an excuse to drink the rest of the bottle with dinner. Learn from my mistakes. Stir the mixture ideally with a flat-edged implement that can scrape up the brown bits from the pan to deglaze it into the winey sauce. With the pan deglazed, add the following ingredients: our diced green and red bell pepper, 1 15-ounce can of diced tomatoes, 1 teaspoon of dried oregano, 1 teaspoon of dried thyme, 2 to 3 bay leaves, a pinch or 2 of red pepper flakes, and traditionally perhaps some capers or olives or something. But I hate both of those, so I use pepperoncini peppers. Use whatever briny, jarred nonsense you like. Stir this mixture to combine, then nestle your chicken thighs back in so that they are slightly but not completely submerged before covering with a lid. If you think your pan is rather light on liquid to be braising properly, that's probably because you forgot to add about a cup of chicken stock, which you had left over in the fridge and was pretty much the main reason you decided to cook this dish tonight, you stupid idiot. So put that in, idiot. Bring to a low simmer with the lid on and cook like so for about 20 to 25 minutes, once again achieving a safe temperature for consumption. Being cooked in a lovely brothy sauce like this improves our odds against non-juicy thighs, but if your meat is up to temperature before your vegetables are tender and your sauce is reduced to your satisfaction, you can remove the meat to a clean plate and boil the liquid for a few minutes until all your desires are met. Only once the sauce is reduced should you taste for salt and pepper and add if needed. If you're wondering where those basil leaves from the beginning ended up, you completely forgot to add them to the dish, idiot. To complement this lovely, rich, brothy dinner, I decided to serve a small salad of baby arugula dressed with olive oil, lemon juice, and shaved Parmesan cheese. Serve up some thighs upon the saucy vegetables. Take 2, you earned it. And make sure to have some small toasty breads for dipping. Oh, and I guess you can garnish with those stupid basil leaves now, you idiot. Our next strategy in our juicy endeavors shall see us venture to the great outdoors, or more specifically, the great deck outside our back door, which is better than a great big deck inside our back door. To make things interesting, I decided to try a technique for a whole chicken. Yes, this video is about thighs, but man cannot live on thigh alone. Max juiciness potential in a barbecue format often hinges upon an overnight brine. Despite this being a critical step, I did not bother to film it. Regardless, find my brine recipe in the description below. We will decant this bird from its brine to the cutting board and towel dry in anticipation of our barbecue dry rub. As a true home barbecue aficionado, naturally I never make the same dry rub twice. Regardless, I wrote this one down for posterity. 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, 2 teaspoons of smoked paprika, 1 teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper, half a teaspoon of cumin powder, half a teaspoon of chili powder. I used ancho chili in this case. Half a teaspoon of mustard powder, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cayenne pepper, 1/4 of a teaspoon of this fancy mango habanero powder. Note that I do not add brown sugar or salt by default to my dry rubs, which allows me to use them in more applications without the risk of over seasoning or over brown sugaring. You will likely have extra when finished with this recipe, but extra dry rub is an excellent thing to have around and use in just about anything, including your coffee or breakfast cereal. For our chicken rub, take half of this dry rub to another dish and mix with 3 to 4 teaspoons of brown sugar and 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. Apply this mixture liberally to the bold bird, massaging to stick. If you don't feel uncomfortable in this step, you are not being thorough enough. Also apply some to the cavity because this image just isn't weird enough. With that thankfully done, put uncovered in the fridge to let the rub set in and dry out a bit. Not all great barbecue demands a sauce, but this one will. A simple yet effective barbecue sauce utilizes the following ingredients: 3/4 of a cup of ketchup, 1/4 cup of bourbon. Many recipes call for twice as much, but I buy good bourbon and I'd rather drink it. 1/4 cup of packed brown sugar or molasses, 1/4 cup of apple cider vinegar, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, which is not as hard to say as people pretend, 1 tablespoon of mustard, 1 teaspoon each of onion powder and garlic powder, or instead you can jazz this up with some of the dry rub if you like. Bring this tiny pot of saucy goodness to a simmer for 5 minutes, enough time for the booze to boil off and the flavors to achieve their potential. There is one last secret ingredient to this endeavor, however: the finest cheap canned lager as enjoyed in ancient El Shadim. We will need half a can for our plan, so enjoy the other half as well as the other 5 cans as we go. Outdoors, we have a smoker of some description, ideally one in less need of a scrub, prepared with some hot, ashy charcoal. As you can see, we are attempting the beer can chicken strategy, albeit without any ridiculous apparatus that big corporate barbecue sellouts insist we must own for only $7.99. To perform this maneuver, the half-full can from earlier must be stuffed inside the chicken's vacant cavity. I spared you the grim imagery, but this should allow the chicken to sit comfortably upright. Comfortably indeed. With our poultry perfectly perched upon a pilsner, we will add a handful of soaked and drained wood chips to the coals, hickory in my case, to produce the delicious healthy smoke that will flavor this bird. With these steps complete, it is now a waiting game. To allow us to remotely monitor this precious poultry, I have a 2-channel wireless thermometer, which is totally not an extravagant and pretentious tool, as you will see. One probe will probe our poultry's perky pecs to keep an eye on its temperature as it cooks, while the second will keep an eye on the temperature inside the grill/smoker. As for chicken, I find it best to maintain 300 to 325 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the process. Adjust the vents on the top and bottom of the smoker as needed to maintain this temperature. Opening the vents introduces more fresh air that will allow the coals to burn hotter. Closing off the vents suffocates them so that they get colder. Be prepared to add more coals to the fire later on if your temperatures start dropping. This is foreshadowing, so be prepared for drama. While obviously the meats are the star of the show at any barbecue, they also tend to yield a prolific bounty of side dishes. Today I shall prepare 3 simple classics with perhaps a couple twists. Observe 2 separate saucepans, each featuring 2 strips of bacon cut into slices. Both are over medium-low heat to begin sizzling and browning the bacon. In one pan we shall prepare some smoky barbecue beans, and the other some lovely collard greens. After a few minutes, when the bacon looks crispy and the fat has rendered out, we will use that fat in both pans to saute a bit of diced onion and garlic. After a few more minutes, when the onions turn translucent around the edges, we will introduce the main events. In the bean pan goes one 15-ounce can of your preferred beans, typically pinto, but all I had were black beans. In the collards pan goes chopped fresh, or in my case frozen collard greens, 8 ounces or about half a bag. Rinse the bean can with about half a cup of water and add it to the pot so that it won't over-reduce while cooking. I also wisely added about a cup of chicken stock to the greens. You may use water if you are desperate. As enhancements, I added about 3 tablespoons of our barbecue sauce to the beans and a couple pinches of the unseasoned dry rub to the greens. These are both to simmer gently for about 30 minutes, checking the liquid levels so that they don't dry out until they become tender and delicious. But I promise you a third side, and it is the fussiest yet most magnificent of the 3, a classic stovetop mac and cheese. We begin with a roux as you do. 1.5 tablespoons of butter melts in a pot. Let this bubble over medium heat until the bubbling subsides, indicating that most of the water has boiled away. Now add about 1.5 tablespoons of flour to the butter and whisk or stir as it cooks and becomes a somewhat nutty brown paste and begins to smell like cooked biscuits. One might observe that I may have let my butter cook for too long before adding the flour, causing it to brown a bit and make my roux look freckly. I do not consider this a problem, and I assume my French friends vehemently disagree. Once the roux has cooked for a minute or two and does not smell like raw flour, begin adding a pint of cold whole milk slowly into the pot, stirring or whisking constantly to combine. This mixture will behave in peculiar ways, such as by thickening when you add the milk, then seeming to separate and become lumpy. This is because the roux has not yet accepted its fate and is trying to confuse you and lead you astray. Persevere by stirring until the lumps go away and adding more milk in stages until you have added about a pint of milk. Once this is done, let it simmer until it becomes thickened enough to coat a spoon in a luxurious film. Congratulations, you have conquered the so-called mother sauce known as bechamel. But what is this French nonsense doing in my barbecue dinner? Well, a bechamel sauce easily becomes a cheese sauce, which becomes the cheese to our mac. A popular belief is that mac and cheese became an American staple after Thomas Jefferson encountered a similar dish in Paris and decided he would serve it to his guests in Monticello. But who cares? Add about half a block of freshly grated cheddar cheese and stir into the sauce. About 4 ounces, but grate some extra just in case. Now would be a good time to taste the sauce for seasoning. With that complete, we will add what was half a box of elbow macaroni, which we cooked in salty water until about 2 minutes shy of being done. What, you didn't cook your macaroni already? How do you think we're gonna make this into mac and cheese then? Anyway, stir that into the sauce along with a couple spoonfuls of the starchy water that the macaroni was boiled in. What, you didn't save any of that? Are you even trying anymore? With the mac now cheese, give it a taste. I decided mine needed some enhancements to both flavor and creaminess, so I grated in some additional cheddar, added some paprika, and got real frisky with a good dollop of cream cheese and a splash more milk. All of that was stirred together until it became the cheesy, saucy, starchy stodge of my dreams. Turn off or lower the heat and cover to keep warm. It was at this point that I noticed my chicken was around 130 degrees Fahrenheit and decided it was time to glaze. I lidded my side dishes to keep them warm while we returned to the outdoors. Notice I applied what remained of my charcoal to the dwindling pile. Using a brush, I painted the barbecue sauce over the chicken evenly. To get a nice glaze, this is something I recommend you do periodically, about every 10 to 15 minutes or every 5 degrees as the chicken cooks. I noticed that the chicken was becoming very dark on the spot facing the coals. This is something you should consider earlier. Being a clever person who understands things, I decided I would turn it around so that the other sides would get more direct heat for a while. Unfortunately, this decision had unforeseen consequences. The chicken shifted upon the can and became unstable, no longer able to stay upright. I attempted to salvage this situation with slapstick results. I briefly cursed myself for not purchasing that beer can chicken apparatus for only $7.99, but I am an engineer, so I applied science and logic to the problem and created a solution. I ditched the can plan entirely and put the grilling grate back onto the grill and laid the chicken upon it, keeping it away from the coals. Reassured of my astounding genius, I continued to glaze the chicken, confident that I would have no further complications. Complications arose when the coals began to subside before the chicken was fully cooked. I had convinced myself that I had a second bag of charcoal already, so I had not purchased more. Needless to say, I was right, I just forgot where I put it. Out of desperation, I had to finish cooking on the propane grill. By this point, the constant mishandling and interruptions to the cooking resulted in a patchy, spotty, and generally unfortunate end product that ultimately seemed overcooked everywhere except where the probe was. But the good news is that taking so long resulted in the side dishes becoming cold and stodgy, so at least they did not overshadow the main event. So let me drown my sorrows with a pitiful amount of remaining barbecue sauce and dig in. Despite being overcooked, the thighs were not totally without juice, as the overnight brine had compensated for my general ineptitude. So I'll pretend that was a lesson all along. Brine your meat to produce the juice. Anyway, forget that disaster. Let's look at the final and most assured way to achieve juicedom. Once again, we begin with a full bird Monty. I realize this video has deviated focus from just the thighs, but I find there are many other attractive features on a bird. Breaking down a whole chicken is grotesque and savage, but one cannot make fried chicken without cracking a few spines. To that end, a pair of chicken shears will emancipate the backbone, which we will set aside for gravy purposes later, along with any giblets that came with the package. Following that, we bifurcate the breasts and end up with 2 half chickens. These would cook very nicely in a smoker, but I am not falling for that trap again so soon. soon. Instead, we will continue to break down by removing the wings, slicing around the joint, and twisting to expose it, allowing us to neatly slice through. The approach is similar with the leg sections. With those removed, separate the drum from the thigh. If this video is not enough to help you master your chicken butchery, watch someone else's video. I only do this like once a year. I take a moment to trim some scraps that will neaten up the product, but also provide more enhancements to our gravy later on. With that, we have our wings, drumsticks, and thighs prepared. To make a classic 10-piece bucket, you could cut the breasts in half to make 4 pieces, but I am instead saving those breasts for another preparation. Besides, I am unable to eat a whole fried chicken by myself, allegedly. Now, to achieve tender, juicy glory, it is time for a southern-style buttermilk soap. 1 cup of buttermilk is decanted into a large enough bowl to fit our bits. To this, we will add a generous shake of a preferred hot sauce. Then we will add a secret ingredient, about 1/4 cup of brine from a jar of pickles. This will not be enough to make your chicken taste like pickles, but will add acid, salt, and a zesty zing. Now it is time for a proprietary blend of herbs and spices that I just made up. 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1 teaspoon of mustard powder, half a teaspoon of dried rosemary, half a teaspoon of dried thyme, 1/4 teaspoon of dried oregano, 1 teaspoon of paprika, half a teaspoon of freshly ground black pepper, 1 teaspoon of salt. Whisk this solution with the smallest, proudest whisk. The mathematically inclined may notice that this did not equal 11 herbs and spices. If I told you the rest, then I would have to kill you. But that said, use whatever herbs and spices tickle your pickle. You are, after all, the winner of your chicken. With the solution solved, add the chicken and gently toss to evenly coat. Cover and let marinate for at least 6 hours, though excessive marination in an acidic brine can yield unpleasant results. Whilst that soaks, we can consider our sides. Classic southern cooking demands buttermilk biscuits. And besides, I have a lot of buttermilk to use. To expedite things, I will use this food processor. To it, add 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, a pinch of salt. Take off screen because the cord on your food processor does not reach the filming area, and pulse a few times to mix the ingredients. Add a total of 7 tablespoons of butter, which were pre-sliced and put in the freezer for about 5 to 10 minutes. Pulse to cut up the butter through the flour for about 12 seconds. Maybe 15 seconds. Okay, 20 seconds. Maybe do not let your butter freeze completely because this does not like to blend. Once you become impatient, dump the crumbly buttery flour into a large bowl. Add 3/4 cup of cold buttermilk and stir together with a spoon. Now you will notice that barely any of the butter actually broke up, so do this better than I did, but we persist out of arrogance. When it starts to come together, it will be easier to finish combining by hand. Do not knead this like a bread dough, as it will yield tough biscuits, just enough that it mostly sticks together into a solid mass of dough. Pat this disc into a rectangle and begin to roll out until it is thin enough that you can fold into thirds like a pamphlet. If you are not sure what a pamphlet is, it is that folded piece of paper that cults leave in your mailbox or under your windshield wiper. Once folded, roll out into a similar rectangle and fold again. Perform this task at least twice more. The purpose here is to create layers of flour and butter throughout the dough that will make them nice and flaky. For your information, this recipe is adapted from Chef John of foodwishes.com. Pro tip to aspiring YouTube chefs: if you claim a recipe is adapted, you can completely rip it off without consequence. After the final folding, roll out to a rectangle about 1/2 inch thick and try to neaten up the edges. You may use a cookie cutter to get rounds, but I do not have one and I do not want to waste dough, so we are getting square biscuits. I cut mine into 8. You can do 6 or 12 or 7 or whatever. While I did not want waste, I might suggest that you cut the folded edges, as these will not separate and rise while these bake. Speaking of baking, space these out on a lined baking sheet, ideally lined with a silicone mat so that they will not stick. You might notice some of mine look quite irregular. That is not a problem because this is a cooking show and I will only put the best looking ones on the plate. Brush with buttermilk to give them a burnished shine after baking and place into a 425-degree oven for about 15 minutes or until fluffy and golden brown. Good enough. Transfer it to a wire rack to cool. Do not put the rack into the pan because that is silly and now you'll have to get it back out of the hot pan. I suppose it is time to make the gravy. To make gravy, we need stock. To make stock, use all the trimmings from the chicken, which includes the spine, trimmed bones, trimmed fat, and the lovely packet of giblets. And start by browning them with vegetable oil over medium-high heat in a pan that ideally holds at least 3 quarts of liquid. Mine just made the mark. After these brown up for a few minutes, add some roughly chopped carrot, celery, and onion, plus a few peeled cloves of garlic. Let these brown for a couple minutes as well. Since this yields quite a bit of stock, I am keeping the flavors basic to yield a fairly all-purpose stock. To that end, I only add a few black peppercorns and a couple of bay leaves. As with dry rub, I do not salt anything because it helps control the saltiness of whatever I cook with it. Once satisfied, fill the pan with 2 quarts of cold fresh water and bring to a boil before reducing to a simmer. While simmering, you will notice foam on top of the water. This comes from the bones and does not look very nice, nor I assume tastes very nice, so skim this off. Might be ideal to do this before adding aromatics because they get in the way. Once good and skimmed, put a lid on it and let it simmer for no less than an hour to yield a lovely liquid. Then strain and set aside for future gravy making. What is the purpose of a gravy, however, without mashed potatoes? So here is a potato. Not very helpful raw, but wait, for you see, this potato is cooked. I boiled it for about 30 minutes in a pot of water, in a valiant effort to find an easy, not time-consuming way to make a lovely single serving of mashed potato. Cutting and boiling potatoes will result in them absorbing some of the water, making them less rich and creamy at the end. Boiling whole should prevent that hazard, but introduces new variables and make it difficult to determine when the potato is done cooking. This potato was not, and I learned this when attempting to mash, so I chopped them up a bit and threw them in the microwave, which honestly might be the easier way to do them altogether. I also wisely decided to perform the mashing in a taller bowl to prevent airborne spuds. Mash briefly before adding in about half a tablespoon of melted butter and 2 to 3 tablespoons of warm milk and season to taste. Finish mashing and then put somewhere to keep warm or get ready to reheat before dinner. Now it is time to dredge our chicken. Remove the pieces from the marinade and dry them off a bit. The marinade shall now become a wash, for we are double dredging today. Add 1 egg and whisk to completion. In the background, I had about 1 cup of flour, which I mixed with a bit of salt. I also added a pinch of salt to the chicken. Many folks think it wise to add spices to the breading, but I do not, for they may burn and taste terrible. Only use salt in the flour. Typical dredging procedure involves a massive bowl of flour, most of which will end up in the garbage once you're done. To avoid that, I lay down a small pillow of flour in a separate dish, then add the chicken pieces before dusting them with more flour. Toss to coat evenly, then return to the egg wash for a quick dipping. Now, to achieve the craggly, crunchy shell of our dreams, add a small amount of the egg wash to the remaining flour and mix together, creating clumps that will fry to a beautiful, crunchy perfection. You may know this as the Kenji Lopez alt technique. Now, reintroduce the chicken to this flour. If necessary, add more flour a bit by bit while tossing together to get an even coating. Yes, this method is more fussy and time-consuming than simply tossing in a bowl with way too much flour, but I am a stickler for food waste at the end of the day.
Jesus.
To make sure this coating is truly set, put the chicken onto a wire rack over a tray and set aside or put in the fridge until ready to fry. Now would be a good time to heat up a pot or cast iron pan with a couple cups of vegetable oil over roughly medium heat. Now to finally make that gravy I talk so much about. You can do this while the chicken is frying, but I am a nervous doo-doo head who struggles to do 2 things at once, so this way I keep control. A gravy, much like a bechamel, begins with a roux. Start by heating a tablespoon or 2 of oil in a saucepan over medium heat, or if you're real smart, use some of the fat skimmed off your chicken stock from earlier. Once hot, add the same amount of flour and start to stir regularly as it cooks. It will gradually become thicker and darken as it cooks. Once it achieves a light brown color, it is time to add the stock. Ideally, do not let it start to smoke like mine did, so be mindful of the heat. Add 1 ladle of the chicken stock and immediately stir or whisk to neutralize lumpiness. Then add another. Make sure to fully combine before each addition and keep going until, I don't know, like 7 or 8 ladles? I didn't measure. Just get it to where it's a fair bit thinner than you want it to be when done, because it will thicken more as it simmers. Speaking of, bring it to a simmer and let it cook for a couple minutes before we begin to perform seasoning procedures. You might notice that this gravy looks a bit pale compared to what you might experience at your favorite local fried bird conglomerate restaurant. No need to fret, as we can adjust both the color and the flavor of this gravy by utilizing 2 secret ingredients: Worcestershire sauce and soy sauce. Introduce in small amounts, stir, and taste. We do not want the flavors of these sauces to dominate the chickeny goodness of the broth, so take care. Once you are satisfied with the flavor and brownness, finish seasoning to taste with salt and fresh black pepper. Once the gravy is finished, you can keep it warm on the back burner, but it may be wise instead to transfer to a bowl and cover with cling film pressed down onto the surface, or else the gravy will form a skin. I don't know, maybe you're into that, you're allowed to be weird. Finally, it is time for this bird to fry. Notice the thermometer in the oil, as the intent is to maintain about 325 to 350 degrees in the oil while the chicken fries. Since the chicken will cause the oil temperature to drop, it is not a bad idea to err on the high side and turn up the burner right before you start adding it in. Right away, I noticed the pan did not have room for the wings, but this will not be an issue, as the wings do not need as long to cook and the thighs will shrink as they spend time in the oil. I wish oil did that to my thighs, but alas. The chicken will take potentially 15 to 20 minutes to cook, and there are 2 states of mind when it comes to frying like this. State 1. Only flip the food once during the entire process. The belief is that frequently flipping will result in the coating becoming less crisp, potentially absorbing more oil. State 2. Screw those idiots. Flipping every few minutes helps regulate the color of the coating. Exposing surfaces before putting them back into the oil creates a similar crispy effect as twice frying. I sit in the latter camp, particularly with cast iron frying, which can easily cause surfaces in contact with the bottom of the pan to burn if left unattended for so long. After a few minutes, space was made for the wings, so I added those in, taking care that the raw coating was not rubbing against neighboring pieces, which would cause them to stick. Now it was a matter of allowing them to brown beautifully until they were done. Note the abundance of greasy droplets all over the stove and counter. This is the burden we must endure to achieve juicy, crispy perfection. Test the chicken with a probe thermometer to ensure doneness before removing to a clean rack. Don't use that nasty gross one the raw chicken was on. What is wrong with you? Warm up your sides while the chicken rests. Finally, with our home thoroughly perfumed with the smell of delicious cholesterol, it is time to assemble our 3-piece meal. I know today was supposed to be all about the thighs, but I can't get any leg without my wingman. Besides, it is always better as a threesome. Lubricate with gravy and prepare yourself. What's that? You think this buttery, greasy brown mess might be a little unhealthy? Fine, we'll add some token frozen vegetables cooked in the microwave. That now makes this a balanced meal and you can safely eat as much as you like. And with that, I presented 4 ways to realize some juicy thighs. Now, if you'll excuse me, I feel like I've lost track of what inspired this video in the first place, and I've been informed that there may have been a euphemism involved that escaped me.